Widowed and blind, she raised 5 boys in a sod house, until a broken gunfighter came home to stay. The horse quit on me 3 miles east of nowhere. Not through me, didn't spook. She just locked her front legs and stopped, and when I pushed heel to her flank she turned her head back and looked at me with one brown eye the way a tired animal does when it has made a decision that has nothing to do with the man on its back. I sat there a minute, maybe longer. The wind came off the plain in a long flat push that smelled like turned dirt and distant rain, and I thought, all right then. I stepped down. My left knee buckled the way it does when I've been in the saddle too many hours, and I grabbed the stirrup leather to keep from going face first into the grass. Mare didn't move. Just stood there blowing softly, her sides heaving, ribs I could count from 6 feet. I'd ridden her too hard out of haze, and I knew it, and I'd done it anyway, which told you something about where my head was. I looked west. Nothing. Looked east. A smudge of dark green along a creek line maybe 2 miles off. Beyond that, the Nebraska sky doing what Nebraska skies do in October, going from white to gray to the color of old iron in about the time it takes to roll a cigarette. I had $4 and some change. A Winchester I'd been thinking about selling, a bedroll that smelled like creek water and old smoke, and a left side that had been hurting since Dodge City in a way I didn't talk about and mostly tried not to think about. A deep grinding kind of hurt that lived just under the lowest rib and came and went without consulting me. I led the mare toward the creek. Her name was Cora, not my naming, she'd come to me already named, off a dead man outside of Ellsworth 2 years prior, and I'd never bothered to change it. Some men named their horses. I'd stopped naming things I might have to leave behind. We made the creek line just as the light was getting flat and gray. I let Cora drink and pulled off her saddle and rubbed her down with a handful of dry grass, which was the best I had. She made a sound low in her throat. I unsaddled her and picketed her on a long rope in the grass. Filled my canteen, ate the last of a piece of dried beef that had gone hard as boot leather, lay down on the bedroll with my hat over my face. Couldn't sleep. That was nothing new. Sleep had been coming harder for 2, maybe 3 years. I'd lie down bone-tired and something behind my eyes would stay lit like a coal that wouldn't go out, and I'd be back in one room or another, one canyon or one street, running through the arithmetic of choices made. I'd chosen wrong a good many times. I knew the ledger. I didn't need to read it every night, but I read it anyway. I was 44 years old, and I was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. My name then was Calhoun, still is I suppose, though I've gone by other things at other times. Cole Calhoun. My father had been a Kentuckian who pushed west after the war and died of a snake bite in Colorado before he got old enough to do something worse. My mother had been a quiet woman who cried at hymns. I hadn't thought about her in years, and I thought about her then, lying on that cold ground by that Nebraska creek, and I didn't know why. I was 3 days past Hays City, and I'd been riding more or less northwest without particular plan. There'd been a marshal in Hays who'd made it plain that my presence was a liability to him, and I'd respected his thinking. I'd had a job there, or something like a job, collecting debts for a man named Winthrop who ran a freight operation, and occasionally something less than that. I'd been at it 7 months. Then there'd been a disagreement between Winthrop and a cattleman named Poole, and 2 of Poole's men had come to my room at the hotel one night to express Poole's displeasure, and I'd expressed mine back, and one of them didn't walk away, and Winthrop wouldn't look me in the eye after that, and the marshal had his conversation with me the next morning over coffee, very polite, very clear. So northwest. I had no destination. That was the honest truth, and I was honest about it only to myself, which is a small kind of honesty, but it's what I had. I'd told myself I was heading toward a man I knew in the Dakota Territory who'd offered me work once. But that offer was 2 years old, and I'd never answered it, and I couldn't have told you why I was headed that way, except that it was a direction, and I needed one. The rain came in around midnight. I pulled the bedroll over my head and listened to it on the ground around me, the flat, soft sound of rain on prairie grass, and at some point I slept. I woke to fog and a sound I couldn't place. Low and rhythmic, came from somewhere north of the creek. I lay still a minute, listening, hand on the rifle without thinking about it. Then I placed it. Chickens. I sat up. The fog sat thick and white on the grass, maybe chest high, so that the far bank of the creek was invisible and the cottonwoods were just shadows. The sound was chickens carrying on the way they do at first light, that low, anxious clucking that builds before it settles. I built a small fire, boiled water in my tin cup and didn't have anything to put in it, but boiled water is better than nothing on a cold morning. My left side was bad. I stood up straight very slowly and took 3 long breaths and it settled to a dull throb. It had been doing that more. I saddled Cora and rode toward the chickens. The sod house came up out of the fog like something that had grown from the ground, which in a way it had. Low and long, walls 3 feet thick of cut prairie sod, a door that faced south, 2 small windows with oilcloth instead of glass. A chicken run along the east wall, a dozen birds working the ground. Beyond that, the remains of a kitchen garden gone to frost, a well with a rope and a wood bucket, a linta with a milk cow in it, the cow watching me with the patient, dull expression of cows. No smoke from the chimney. Might mean nobody home or might mean the fire was banked low. I sat the mare and looked at it a minute. The fog was beginning to thin. There was a row of small somethings along the south wall, low to the ground in a line. I looked at them and then I understood. Egg crates. Maybe a dozen of them, the wood kind, stacked too high and covered with an oilcloth. I was about to call out when the door opened. She came out carrying 2 buckets, one in each hand, moving with the brisk, unhurried walk of a woman who has somewhere to be and doesn't waste time getting there. She was maybe 40, hard to say. Her hair was dark going to gray, pinned back loose. Plain dress, heavy canvas apron over it. She wore boots that laced to the knee. She got 10 feet from the door and stopped. She put her head up and turned it slightly to the left, not looking at me. Her eyes were open and they were pointed roughly in my direction, but they weren't tracking me, weren't fixing on me. They were a dark brown and they were entirely still. She said, "Who's there?" Not a question exactly, a statement with room for an answer. I said, "Just a traveler. My horse needed water last night. I camped at the creek." She set both buckets down. Her hands went to her apron, just resting there. She said, "Headed where?" "North, maybe Dakota." She was quiet a moment. She turned her head slightly, like she was locating me by sound. I'd seen her eyes and I was thinking about what I'd seen and trying to decide what I'd understood. She said, "You eat." "Last night." "That's not what I asked." I said, "No, ma'am." She picked the buckets back up. "Water's in the well, grains in the lean-to left side. You can turn your horse out in the south pasture. There's a gate." She went past me toward the chicken run without another word. I sat on Cora and watched her go. She walked straight and sure, not slow, not testing the ground with her feet. She knew every inch of this yard. She unlatched the chicken run by feel and went in, moving between the birds without looking at them, reaching under them, pulling eggs and placing them in the apron pocket she made by folding up the front of it. She was talking to the chickens, too low for me to hear. I watered the mare and let her out in the pasture. The door of the sod house was open when I came back. I stood in the doorway. There was a fire going, small but steady. A long table rough sawn with 6 chairs around it. A dry goods shelf. A curtained-off corner I took to be a bed. On the table, a cast iron pan, and she was standing at the stove breaking eggs into it with one hand while the other rested lightly on the stove's edge, just touching it. I said, "I don't mean to put you out." She said, "Sit down." I sat. She cooked. She moved around that kitchen like water moves around rocks, smooth and without hesitation, reaching for things in the exact spot they always were, setting them back exactly. a tin of flour, a bag of salt. She cut cornbread from a pan on the shelf, 4 slices, put them on a tin plate, put that in front of me without looking at the table, just reached out and set it down where she'd calculated my hands would be. I watched her and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say. She poured coffee from a blue enamel pot, slid the pan of eggs off the fire, divided them most onto my plate, less onto hers, sat down across the table, felt for her cup, drank. I ate. The eggs were good. The cornbread was better. She said, "Where'd you come from?" "Hayes City." "What were you doing in Hayes?" "Working." "What kind of work?" I looked at her. Her face was turned maybe 15 degrees off of me. Not evasive, she just had no way to know exactly where I was looking. Her eyes were those same still dark eyes that didn't track. Beautiful was the word I didn't use. There was a quality in her face that had nothing to do with prettiness, a kind of density, like a person who'd been through considerable weather and had taken a shape from it. I said, "Collecting debts." She heard the pause before that. I think she heard most things. She said, "Before that." I said, "Various things." She drank her coffee, didn't push. I said, "What's your name, ma'am, if you don't mind me asking?" "Ruth Corder." "Cole Calhoun." She nodded. "There are boys, 5 of them. They're in the pasture minding the cattle. They'll be back at midday. I'm telling you so you're not surprised." I said, "How old?" 14, 12, 10, 7, and 4. I looked around the sod house. At the single room, the curtained bed, the rows of canned goods, the children's things hung on pegs along the wall, 5 coats, 5 sets of boots below them, lined up small to large. I thought about what it meant to run this place, these 5 boys, this Operation Eggs at what I now understood was probably Dawn, sold to someone, a town, a buyer, and all of it done in the dark she lived in. I said, "Your husband?" "Dead 3 years. She said it flat, not hard, just the facts of it. I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "He was a good man. We don't get to keep them as long as we'd like." She stood and took her plate to the dry sink. "You're welcome to stay the day and rest your horse. If you're a man who can work, there's wood that needs splitting. I won't press you." She went back out the door, back to the chickens. I sat at that table for a while. Then I went and found the axe. I don't know why I stayed. That's not exactly true. I know some of the reasons and I've told myself others, and somewhere in there is the truth. The wood needed splitting, that much was factual. There was a pile of logs behind the sod house, cottonwood and scrub oak and a splitting block, and an axe with a cracked handle that had been wrapped in rawhide, and I went at it for 2 hours, maybe 3. My left side complained. I ignored it. The rhythm of it helped. There's something in that work, the lifting and the strike and the clear ring of the split, that empties a man's head. I hadn't felt empty in a while. The boys came back at midday. They came around the corner of the house in a clump, 4 of them, the eldest walking ahead, the littlest one trying to keep up, and they stopped when they saw me, and the eldest one put himself in front of the younger ones without thinking about it, just moved there. He was tall for 14, raw-boned, serious face. He looked at me the way his mother had, not afraid, just measuring. He said, "Who are you?" I said, "Cole Calhoun. Your mother said I could split wood for a meal." He looked at the pile I'd stacked, looked back at me. "5th one's inside," he said. "He's 4, he gets underfoot." I said, "What's your name?" "Eli." He pointed at the others in order. "That's Henry, James, and George." Henry was 12. James was 10. George was 7 and was staring at me with his mouth slightly open, the way children do when something has come into their world that doesn't fit a category they own yet. The 4th one, the 4-year-old, appeared in the doorway of the sod house, barefoot, holding a tin mug with both hands, and looked at me with absolute seriousness. Eli said, "That's Caleb." I nodded at Caleb. Caleb nodded back with great formality. I split wood. Ruth came out and the boys did their afternoon work. I watched them through the work of the axe, and they were good workers, all of them, even George, who was small but didn't goof off. She directed them with half sentences, almost no words, and they knew what she meant. Sometimes she just tilted her head in a direction and the nearest boy went to see about whatever was in that direction. She'd been doing this a long time. They had a language. At supper she made a stew that tasted like it had been simmering since morning, which it probably had. She fed 6 people from a single pot, and it was enough for all of us. The boys ate fast and quietly. There was a low kind of order to the table, who sat where, who passed what, the littlest one in a chair with a board across the arms that raised him up, George cutting Caleb's food without being told. Eli watched me most of the meal, not hostile, evaluating. After, he helped his mother clear, while the younger ones went about evening chores. I sat on the step outside with my coffee. After a while, Eli came out and sat on the ground a few feet from me. He said, "You carrying a gun?" I said, "Yes." "What kind?" "Colt, and I've got a Winchester on the saddle." He was quiet a minute. He said, "Are you trouble?" I said, "Not for people I owe." He thought about that. He said, "My mother said you could sleep in the lean-to if you need a dry night. There's room with the cow." I said, "I'll pay for the meal." "She won't take money." I said, "Then I'll split more wood tomorrow." He looked at me, said, "She can't tell if a man's looking at her a certain way, you know. Her eyes don't work, but I can. I'm telling you because it matters." 14 years old, I said, "Understood." He got up and went inside. I sat with the coffee until it went cold, and then I went and slept in the lean-to with the cow, who didn't object. In the morning I stayed. I told myself I was waiting for the rain that was coming. You could smell it. The sky had that iron weight to it. I told myself my horse needed the rest. Both things were true. They weren't the only true things. The rain came that afternoon, a cold, steady Nebraska rain that came in off the west and didn't appear to be in a hurry to leave. I fixed the lean-to roof where 3 of the sod blocks had slipped. I found a broken hinge on the gate and swapped it from the inside of the gate to the outside where the stress was less. I didn't tell Ruth about these things. I just did them. She knew anyway. In the evening she said, "You fixed the lean-to." I said, "Roof had a gap." She said, "I know it did. Been meaning to get Eli up there. He doesn't love heights." I said, "He's a good boy." She poured coffee, set mine on the table near my hand, said, "He's been the man of this place for 3 years. That's too much for 14, but he doesn't complain." I said, "No. He doesn't seem like the complaining kind." She sat down. She had a piece of mending in her hands, doing it by feel, the way she did everything. A sock. She ran her fingers over the hole and positioned the needle and went in without looking. Her hands were something. They'd told me more in 2 days than her face had. She said, "What happened to your side?" I went still. I said, "Nothing." She said, "You favor it when you think no one's watching, and I heard you at the well this morning. You breathed wrong pulling the bucket." I said, "Nothing serious." She said, "I didn't ask if it was serious." I looked at her. She was stitching and not stitching at me. I said, "I took a bullet 2 years ago. It didn't come out clean, healed over. Some days it's fine." She said, "Some days it's not." "No." She stitched, said, "You should have a doctor look at it." I said, "I've seen a few." She said, "What do they say?" "Varies." She put the sock down on the table and folded her hands on top of it. She said, without any particular edge, "Mr. Calhoun, I don't have the sight God gave most people. What I have instead is that I notice things. I've noticed you wince 3 times today, and I've noticed you haven't talked about your plan since you said Dakota Territory 2 mornings ago." I didn't say anything. She said, "I'm not asking you to account for yourself. I'm just saying what I see." I said, "That's more than most people with working eyes notice." She picked the sock back up. "Most people with working eyes don't have to." The rain came down on the sod roof, that muffled soft sound. The boys were in the curtained corner, the three littler ones asleep, Eli reading by a candle, Henry already out. The fire had gone to coals. It was warm in a way I hadn't been in a while. I said, "I don't have a plan, is the truth." She said, "I know." We sat there with the rain. After a while she said, "There's a spare blanket on the shelf. The nights are getting cold." She stood up, put the mending away, felt her way to the curtain and went to bed. I took the blanket and went back to the lean-to. 5 days. That's how long I was there before I understood I wasn't leaving. Day 3, I repaired the saddle rack in the lean-to that had collapsed. Day 4, I rode into a place called Plum Fork, 8 miles east, with a load of egg crates in a borrowed wagon, because Ruth had said she sold them Tuesdays and this was Tuesday. She told me the route without asking if I knew it. She drew it in words, not pictures, and every landmark was a sound or a smell or the feel of the road, because those were the kinds of landmarks she used. The egg buyer in Plum Fork was a man named Dorch who ran a dry goods. He counted the crates, counted me, and tried to short her 3 cents a dozen. I set my hands on the counter. He paid the full rate. I came back with $22 and a sack of flour she'd asked me to pick up. She was at the table when I came in. I set the money down and counted it out. She ran her fingertips over the coins, and then she went still for just a moment. She said, "He usually pays me 16. I said he miscounted. She was quiet, then she said, "Did he?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." A long pause. She picked up the coins and put them in the tin she kept on the shelf. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Calhoun." Day 5, I woke up before first light with the pain in my side bad enough that I lay still and waited for it to pass, and it didn't pass. It shifted, which was different than usual. Something tidal about it, pulling down and inward. I'd felt it before once in the fall, and then it had gone away for months, and I'd told myself it was nothing and believed myself because I wanted to. I lay in the lean-to with the cow breathing soft beside me, and the stars going out one by one outside the gap in the wall, and I thought, this is what that is. I didn't know exactly what it was. I knew it was the bullet, or where the bullet had been, or what the bullet had left when it went in wrong and came out worse. I'd been told things by a doctor in Wichita whose face I couldn't recall now, technical things I'd only half listened to, about scarring and something about the tissue around it, and I'd nodded and paid him and walked out and not thought about it much, because thinking about it didn't help, and I'd gotten good at not thinking about things that didn't help. But lying there in the dark, with the pain doing what it was doing, I thought about Ruth Corder. I thought about Eli sitting in front of the younger ones. I thought about 5 coats on 5 pegs. I thought about a woman selling eggs at dawn in the fog and not being able to see the man on the horse who was about to change or not change. There was still the not change option, the shape of her life. I got up. I was careful. I went to the well and drank a long, cold drink of water and stood there looking at the dark plain to the east, where the sky was just beginning to go from black to the color of a bruise. She came out. She always came out at first light, I'd learned that. She came out the door with her buckets, moving the way she always moved, and she walked 20 feet toward the chicken run and then she stopped. She said, "How bad?" I said, "It comes and goes." She turned toward me. She said, "Is it coming or going right now?" I said, "Coming." She stood there with both buckets. She said, "There's a doctor in Dawson City, which is 14 miles. He's decent." She paused. "I've sent Eli for him once before, for George, when he cut himself on a plow blade. He came." I said, "I don't need a doctor." She said, "Mr. Calhoun." I said, "I'll be all right." She set both buckets down very carefully on the ground. She turned to face me fully. She said, "I cannot see your face. I cannot tell if you're lying to me or lying to yourself. I can tell you're doing one of those things, and I'd ask you to stop." The sky was gray now, that cold, flat, early October gray. I could see her face clearly. She was looking at me or at the space I occupied, and her expression was not soft, not worried, not pitying. Something else. Something I didn't have a good name for, like she decided something. I said, I don't want to make trouble for you. She said, I'll decide what's trouble for me. I said, I'm not a good man, Mrs. Corder. I want you to understand that. She was quiet for a moment. She said, I know what kind of work you said you did in Hayes, and I've been thinking about what kind of work that usually is and what a man looks like who does it, and I've been listening to you for 5 days. She paused. You are not a good man by the measure you want to be. That's not the same thing. I looked at her. She said, I'm going to send Eli for the doctor. You're going to stay still. And when the doctor's done, I'd like you to think about whether there's something you could do here, on this place, for a fair wage and a fair room, that doesn't involve riding toward Dakota territory without a plan. I said, why? She said, because this winter will be hard. Because I have 5 boys and one of them is 14, and I've been carrying too much of the load of this place on him for too long. And because, she stopped, started again. And because you fixed the lean-to roof without being asked. And because you got me $6 more for my eggs than I've seen in 3 years. And because you came and drank water at the well at 4 in the morning, instead of saddling your horse and leaving, which a man with no reason to stay would have done. I stood there with the dark plain behind me, and the fog coming in off the grass, and a woman who couldn't see me looking straight at me. I said, you'd be taking a risk. She said, I've been taking risks since the day I was born. This one I'm taking with my eyes open. She picked up her buckets. Eli's a light sleeper. I'll tell him to start at first light. She went to the chickens. The doctor's name was Everett. He was maybe 60, thin, gray, the kind of man who'd seen enough that nothing surprised him. He came with a black bag, and he examined me at the table while Ruth and the boys were out, and he was quiet a long time, and then he said what he said. He said the original wound had scarred in a way that put pressure on something internal, and that it would periodically inflame and periodically subside, and that this might continue for years or it might not. He said the cold and the riding were not helping. He said rest and warmth, and not doing something stupid were the prescription. He said he could give me something for the pain that wouldn't knock me out, and I said I didn't want anything that fogged my head. He said that was up to me. He said if the pain became severe, he used a word I won't repeat, but he described a specific kind of severe, I should come to Dawson City immediately. I asked him what severe meant in terms of time. He looked at me with gray eyes that had seen a lot of men ask that question for a lot of different reasons. He said, could be 10 years, could be 10 months. You're not in immediate danger, but you are not entirely well, and I'd suggest you act accordingly. He took $2 for the call, which was less than I expected. He stopped at the door and said, Mrs. Corder is one of the most capable people in this county. What she's built here is remarkable. He said it the way you say a true thing to a man who should know it. Then he left. I sat at the table and looked at my hands. Ruth came in about 10 minutes later. She'd clearly been waiting. She stood in the doorway and she said, well. I said, he said, rest. She said, then you'll rest. I said, Mrs. Corder. Ruth. I looked at her. She was in the doorway with the pale October light behind her, the plain stretching out brown and wide and the sky big and cold above her. I want to be honest with you. I've done things I can't take back. I've lived a certain way for a long time, and it's not the kind of way that leaves a man in a good place. I don't know that I'm worth. Stop, she said, not hard, just final. She came the rest of the way into the house and closed the door and went to the stove. She poured coffee. She put mine on the table near my hand without looking at the table. She sat down. She said, my husband Thomas was a man with about $2 in his pocket and a $300 dream every day of his life. He was wrong about money more times than I can count. He got on the wrong side of 2 different men who were worse than him, and it nearly cost us the land. He loved me harder than any man has loved a woman, and he was gone at 41 from a fever that a doctor in a bigger town might have beaten. She drank her coffee. She said, "I'm not asking about your past because your past is going to work this land. You are." I said, "You don't know me." She said, "I know you better than you think." She set her cup down. "I told you I can't see your face. What I have instead is how a man breathes when he thinks no one's listening. How fast he comes when a child calls, whether he handles a frightened animal rough or quiet. You've been here 5 days, Mr. Calhoun. Cole." She tried my name out the first time she'd used it. "I know what I know." I looked at her face. She wasn't looking at mine. Her hands were folded around her cup, those capable hands, and there was nothing performing in her, nothing selling. She was just a woman saying a thing she decided was true. I said, "All right." She said, "All right what?" I said, "All right, I'll stay, if you'll have me." She nodded. She stood up. She said, "Wage is room and board and $3 a month until spring. We'll see about spring when we get there." She went back out to do whatever she'd been doing. I sat at the table for a while. Winter came in November. Nebraska winter is nothing like the winter I'd grown up with in Kentucky. There's nowhere to hide from it. It comes out of the northwest like something with a purpose, and it brings the sky down to the ground, and the world goes white and gray, and the cold is the kind of cold that has no interest in your preferences or your coat or your intentions. I learned the rhythms of the place. Mornings, the chickens, the cow, the fire. Get the boys fed and the older 3 off to do what needed doing before the light went. Mid-mornings, the bigger work, fence line, the root cellar, the stores. Ruth had laid in a good supply of canned goods, but there were gaps, things that hadn't stretched as far as she'd planned, and I filled some of them. I was good at the land work. I'd grown up doing it before I'd grown up doing other things, and the hands remembered. Afternoons, the wood, always more wood. Eli helped with that, and he was strong for 14, not as strong as he needed to be, and we split together and stacked, and he didn't talk much, which suited me. We had a language too, eventually. He'd hand me the piece, I'd set it. He'd stack what I'd split. The crack of the axe and the cold air and the steam of our breath. One afternoon in November, maybe 3 weeks after I'd stayed on, he said, without preamble, "My father used to do this." I said, "He a good man with an axe?" Eli thought about it. "Fair, he was better with cattle." I said, "Your mother says he loved this place." He said, "Another piece on the block." He said, "He loved her." The place was part of that. He was quiet a minute. Then he said, "She cried for about 2 weeks when he died. Then she stopped and she didn't again, not where we could see. She just," he made a motion with his hand, "started." I split the piece, set the axe against the block. I said, "She's the strongest person I've ever met." He looked at me from under the brim of his hat. He said, "Yeah." He picked up the split halves and stacked them. He said, "She talks about you when you're not in the house." I said, "What does she say?" He said, "That you're here." He stacked another piece. "She said it like it meant something, just that you're here." I didn't say anything. I picked up the axe. Evening, that was the time I thought of as hers. After supper, after the boys were in bed or near it, she'd sit at the table with her mending or her accounts. She kept the accounts in her head mostly, but she had a system with knotted strings that I didn't understand, but that she used to keep track of numbers, and I'd be across from her, and we'd talk or not talk. We talked more than I'd have predicted. She told me about Thomas, about the early years here, when this had been raw ground and they'd cut the sod themselves, just the 2 of them and Eli, who was a baby, and how the first winter they'd nearly not made it. She told me about her sight, which had gone gradually over several years. A disease the doctor in Omaha had named, but she hadn't kept the name for, so that she'd had time to learn the dark, to memorize it, to build her world in the space of what she could touch and hear and smell before the last of it went. She said it wasn't what people thought. People thought it was like a lamp going out. She said it was more like, she paused, looking for the word, more like moving furniture. She'd moved all the furniture in her life into a new arrangement, and she knew where everything was, and she could move through the room fine. It was only strangers and new things that required extra work. I said, "Am I new furniture?" She smiled. She almost never smiled, but she did then. She said, "You were. You're getting sorted." I told her things too. Less than she told me, but more than I'd told anyone in a long time. I told her about my father dying, about the war, which I'd been too young for but had seen the end of, the rough end, the clean-up end, which was not a thing to be romantic about. I told her about the first time I'd used a gun in a way that mattered, which had been for a legitimate reason, and about the ways it had not always been legitimate since. She listened. She didn't absolve me. She didn't condemn me. She just held it, the way a container holds water without being the water. She said one night in late November, "What were you hoping for when you rode out of Hayes?" I said, "I don't think I was hoping for anything." She said, "That's the saddest thing you've told me." I said, "I know." She said, "What do you hope for now?" I looked at her across the table, the lamp between us, the fire low, the sound of the boys breathing in the dark behind the curtain. I said, "Something quiet, something real." She said, "That's a start." December. Henry got sick. Chest something. A cough that went deep and stayed, and Ruth worked with poultices and steam, and a tea she made from things she kept dried in a row of jars I'd never have been able to tell apart, and I rode to Dawson City twice for medicine, once at night through the kind of cold that makes your face hurt after 3 minutes. Henry got better. 2 weeks it took, and during that Ruth slept 3 hours a night, and I know because I could hear her moving, hear the boys, hear her voice low and steady in the dark. The night Henry's fever broke, I was sitting on the step outside in the cold. I'd been inside most of the day and I needed air. She came out. She sat down next to me, not far away. She had a blanket around her shoulders. She said, "He's going to be fine." I said, "I know," I could hear it. She was quiet. She leaned her head back against the sod wall, her profile in the moonlight hard to describe. Not beautiful the way women in drawings are beautiful, something older than that. Like a face a good sculptor makes when he stopped worrying about making something pretty. She said, "I prayed for 4 nights. I said, "Did it help?" She said, "Praying helps me. Whether it helps God is God's business." She paused. "Do you pray?" I said, "Not in a long time." She said, "What do you do instead?" I said, "I don't know, sit." She said, "Maybe that's a kind of praying." We sat in the cold. After a while her hand found my arm, just resting there, the way you reach for a post in the dark to know where you are. She wasn't leaning on me, just touching. She said, "Thank you for staying." I said, "I wouldn't have been anywhere better." She said, "I know, I mean for staying when you didn't have to, when the reason to go was more obvious than the reason to stay." She paused. "I don't think you know quite what it's meant, to the boys, too." She stopped. I didn't finish the sentence for her. She took her hand back. She stood up, gathered the blanket. She said, "Go to sleep, Cole." She went inside. I sat out there a while longer in the cold, with the stars very clear, and the plain very wide, and the darkness something I'd stopped being uneasy in. Christmas. I hadn't thought about Christmas in years, honestly. You get out of the habit. Ruth made a thing of it, though not big. They didn't have the means for big, but considered. She'd been making things since October, small things for the boys. Eli a new belt she'd braided herself, Henry a jackknife she'd had set aside, James and George each a thing I didn't see. Caleb she'd made a toy horse out of leather scraps. I found her working on it one morning when I came in early, and she tucked it under the table, and I pretended I hadn't seen. I rode to Dawson City a week before Christmas and spent most of a month's wage on things. I didn't make a production of it. I put the packages with the other ones under the shelf where she stored them. She found them when she was organizing. She ran her hands over the packages. She could read the wrapping, tell what I'd tied, and she was still for a moment, and then she went on with what she was doing. Christmas morning, the boys were up before light. Ruth sat at the table and listened to them, and she was smiling the real smile, the rare one, all morning. Caleb dragged the leather horse around by the tail and made sound effects. George and James had a minor argument about a shared tin of hard candy that was resolved by Eli telling them to quit it in a way that ended the matter. Henry sat at the table next to me with his new jackknife, opening and closing it. After, Ruth said to me quietly, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "I know." She said, "They'll remember it." I said I wanted to. She looked at me, her eyes finding the space I was in, not my eyes but the air near me, and she said, "So will I." January was the hard month. The cattle count came up short. Not disaster short, but enough that the spring sales math got tight. I rode the fence line in whether I wouldn't have sent a dog out in and found 3 breaks and fixed them, but the cattle that had drifted were lost to the county and not coming back. I sat up 3 nights with a heifer that was calving wrong, got the calf eventually. The mother didn't make it. Eli was with me for that, and he took it hard in the way boys take things when they're trying not to, the tight jaw, the careful movements. I didn't say anything useful because there wasn't anything useful to say. We cleaned up and I made coffee and we sat in the lean-to until it got light. He said, "Is it always like this?" I said, "The land, yes." He said, "My father used to say, the land didn't care about you, but it didn't not care either. It was just what it was." I said, "That's about right." He was quiet. He said, "I used to think I wanted to go east, to a city, work in a, I don't know, accounting house, something with walls." I said, "You still think that?" He was quiet longer this time. He said, "Less than I used to." I said, "This is good land. Another 5 years if the weather holds and you could have twice the cattle, a real house eventually. Your mother's got a head for it." He said, "She does." I said, "So do you." He looked at me. He had his mother's eyes, that same stillness. He said, "Are you going to stay?" I said, "That's up to your mother." He said, "I know. I'm asking your intentions." 14 years old, I looked at him. I said, "My intention is to earn my place here every day until I've earned enough that it's mine to stay in." He held that for a moment, then he nodded. He stood up, picked up his hat. He said, "Fair." He walked out into the snow toward the house. February. I want to tell this part plain, because it didn't happen the way these things happen in stories. It was a Sunday. The boys were occupied and Ruth was at the table with her accounts, the knotted strings spread out in front of her, running her fingers along them. I'd been outside most of the morning and I came in and poured coffee and sat down. I said, "I need to tell you something." She went still, not afraid, still, listening still. I said, "I'm not sure how to say this." She said, "Try the plain way. It usually works." I said, "I want to stay here, not as an employee. I want to ask you whether you'd have any interest, whether you might consider." I stopped. She said, "Go on." I said, "I'm not the man I want to be yet, but I'm more of him here than I've been anywhere, and I think," I stopped again, "I think you ought to know that." The room was quiet, outside the wind, the fire. She said, "I've been expecting this conversation for about a month." I said, "Have you?" She said, "I told you I notice things." I said, "What do you think of it, of the idea?" She ran her hands over the strings again, a habit, a thinking motion. She said, "You are 44 years old and have lived hard and carry something in you that may not fully heal. You are not a man of property or savings. You have a history that some people in this county would hold against both of us." I said, "All true." She said, "You are also the only man since Thomas who has made this place feel like a whole thing, instead of something I'm holding together with 2 hands while it tries to fall apart." She turned her face toward me, that stillness in her eyes. She said, Thomas used to say when I went blind, I want to be clear that this is what he said. He said, I see more of you than most people see of anything. She paused. I've been thinking about that, about what seeing means, about what I know. I said, what do you know? She said, I know you came to this place worn down to the bone and you stayed and you put yourself into it, and it put something back into you. I know you handle my boys like they're worth something. I know you rode 14 miles through a blizzard for medicine for a sick child without being asked. She said, I know you are here. She said it the way Eli had reported she said it, like it meant something beyond itself. I reached across the table. I put my hand near hers, not on hers, near, so she'd know where it was. She moved her hand and put it on top of mine. Her hand was calloused and warm, and it sat on mine like something that belonged there. She said, I'm not a woman who does things without thinking them through. I've thought this through. I said, and? She said, and I think you should ask me properly when the weather is better. In the spring, outside, I want to hear the birds. I turned my hand over under hers. She laced her fingers between mine and held on, not tight, just held. She said, I want Eli to know before the others. It's important. I said, I'll talk to him. She nodded. She said, you should know I am not an easy woman. I have strong opinions about how this place should be run, and I'm usually right, and I don't soften that much. You would not be marrying someone who needs saving. I said, I know. She said, I would be marrying someone who needs steadying, who knows how to work, who will not flinch when things get hard. I said, I know. She said, I need you to be sure. I said, Ruth. She waited. I said, I have been unsure of almost everything in my life. I am not unsure of this. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she squeezed my hand once and let go and went back to her accounts. I sat there with the coffee going cold and the fire going and the wind outside doing what it does, and I felt something I couldn't name exactly. It wasn't happiness exactly, or not only that. It was more like fitting, like a joint that's been out of place going back, and you don't know how wrong it's been until you feel it right. I talked to Eli the next day. We were at the wood pile. I just said it plain, that I had feelings for his mother, that I'd said so, that she'd received it, and that I was asking him not his permission but his honest thinking, because he'd earned the right to be asked. He split a piece, stacked it, split another. He said, she's been alone for 3 years. I said, I know. He said, she's not, she wouldn't do this unless she was sure. She doesn't do things she's not sure of. I said, I know that too. He split another piece. He said, are you good to her? I said, I'm trying to be. He said, try harder. I said, yes. He split another piece. Then he said, all right. Just that, all right. He picked up the stack and carried it to the woodpile, and that was that. Spring came the way spring comes on the plain, suddenly and with intent. March, then April, the grass coming in that particular green that doesn't exist anywhere but the prairie in April, the kind of green that makes you understand why people stayed. The cattle on the new grass, the chickens making more noise, the kitchen garden going in, Caleb underfoot, George and James taking turns at the row lines while Eli and Henry and I worked the south field. The morning I asked her was a Sunday, early May. I'd said in the spring outside with the birds. The meadowlarks were going. There were about 4 of them in the long grass south of the house, singing at each other or at the morning or at nothing in particular, that liquid broken sound that carries so far on still air. She was sitting on the step. She'd come out for her morning walk, which she took every day, a loop she'd memorized, around the house and out to the creek and back, and she'd stopped on the step. She was listening to the birds. I sat down next to her. She said, meadowlarks. I said, 4 of them. She said, I can hear 4. We sat a minute. I said, Ruth. She said, yes. I said, will you marry me? She turned her face to me, the morning light on her, 40 years old in the line of her jaw and the dark going gray hair loose in the morning, the way it was before she pinned it. She said, I thought you'd make a speech. I said, I thought about it. She said, and? I said, didn't seem like you. She smiled, that real smile. She said, no. It doesn't. She reached out and found my hand and held it. She said, yes, Cole. The birds kept singing. The plain went out wide and green in every direction. The house behind us with 5 boys in it who were going to need breakfast and who were going to make the morning loud as soon as they woke, which was going to be any minute. She was still holding my hand. I looked at the plain. I thought about the man who'd ridden into this yard out of the fog 8 months ago, broke and worn and riding toward nothing. I thought about what that man had been worth in the accounting of himself. Not much, was his own answer. A used-up man past his best use, with a bad side and a worse history and no particular place to be. I thought about what she'd said, about seeing. I couldn't say she was wrong about what she saw. I couldn't say I was certain she was right. But I could say that here, in this place, with this woman and these 5 boys and this land, I was doing the work. I was getting up and doing the work. And the work was making me something I recognized as better than what I'd been. She'd done that, not by doing anything to me, just by holding still long enough to see what was there and then saying so and then not moving. She squeezed my hand once and stood up. She said, I'll tell the boys at breakfast. She went inside. I sat on the step for a while, listening to the meadowlarks, the morning light coming up long and gold across the grass, the plain running out to the sky in every direction, and the house warm behind me, and I was where I was supposed to be. Which was here. Which was a thing I hadn't been able to say in all honesty since I was a boy, maybe not even then. The door opened, and Caleb came out barefoot and stood next to me and looked at the grass. He said, birds. I said, meadowlarks. He considered this. He said, Mama says you're staying. I said, that's right. He looked at me with the absolute seriousness of 4 years old. He said, good. He went back inside. I stayed on the step until I heard Ruth calling them all to breakfast, her voice carrying out through the door, and then I stood up, and my left side was quiet for once, and I went inside to eat.